Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we hear from retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, author of the new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. McMaster discusses his theories of strategic empathy, as well as the National Security Council processes that he implemented in the Trump administration, and discusses threats posed by Russia, China, and a myriad of other actors throughout the world. This wide-ranging discussion is moderated by Dr. Jim Golby of the Clements Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Let's listen in.
I'm sure there are many people out there familiar with the details of General McMaster's biography, his initiative and battlefield leadership during both Desert Storm and Tal Afar during Operation Iraqi Freedom, his best-selling historical account of the Joint Chiefs of Staff role in the Vietnam War, dereliction of duty, and his leadership in various senior positions in the U.S. military and U.S. government, culminated with his time as the National Security Advisor earlier in this administration. But if you'll indulge me, I'm going to tell a quick personal story about HR. In February 2002, I was a young armor officer in the Armor Officer Basic Course in Fort Knox, Kentucky, preparing to head to the 1st Squadron, 4th U.S. Cavalry in Schweinfurt, Germany a few months later. I placed a call to the personnel officer in the unit at the time, Paulie Kratiger, but I was surprised when instead the squadron commander answered the phone. It turned out it was a training holiday for U.S. units in Germany, and then Lieutenant Colonel McMaster was the only person in the office. A little over an hour later, he placed the unit SOPs in the mail to me, given me 4 books and a few articles to read, and he'd helped connect my wife with someone in the legal office on posts, which later led to a job interview. I never actually overlapped with him in Schweinfurt, but I did when I was on Vice President Pence's national security staff in early 2017. And there I observed some of the same commitment to rigor, to intensity, and dedication to the people he led during the 5 or 6 months we overlapped at the White House. So it's a real honor for me today to welcome retired General H.R. McMaster to speak to all of us about his book. General McMaster, over to you.
Hey, Jim, what a pleasure it is to be with you. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and it's also great to be, at least virtually, back at the University of Texas, where I spent a lot of time researching in the Johnson Library for dereliction of duty. But first of all, just thanks to all viewers, anybody who's here it's a great privilege to be able to talk with you about Battlegrounds. I wrote the book, as I mentioned in the author's note in the beginning, because I really wanted to contribute to a more full understanding of the challenges and opportunities that we face internationally as a way, I think, so that we can work together to build a better future for generations to come. And I'm concerned about how polarized we've become, how much of our discourse is vitriolic and partisan in nature. And I don't think that these challenges that we face or these opportunities that are in front of us should be partisan in any way. And in Battlegrounds, I tell the story of, at least my interpretation of how we lost our strategic competence, how we lost our confidence as well in our ability to implement a reasoned and sustained approach to foreign policy. And Jim, you mentioned the Gulf War. I begin really with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, our victory over communism and the Soviet Union, followed very rapidly by the Gulf War in 1991, and an overwhelming military victory over the 4th largest army in the world. And what I argue is the 90s became a period of confidence. Okay, we had reason to be confident, but that confidence grew to overconfidence, and that overconfidence bred, I think, complacency as we bought in to these three assumptions about the nature of the post-Cold War world. First of all, this belief held by many that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Related to that assumption, an assumption that great power competition was a relic of the past. And a third related assumption was that our military prowess demonstrated in the Gulf War meant that our security was guaranteed by really the technological advantages that our military held over other militaries. And if any country had the temerity of threatening the United States, that the future war would be fast, cheap, and efficient. This is the so-called orthodoxy of the revolution in military affairs. And what I argue in the book is that these three assumptions were kind of a setup. They were a setup for the frustrations that we encountered in the 2000s. After especially these terrorists associated with Al Qaeda used box cutters and airplanes to bypass our military prowess and commit the most devastating terrorist attack in history. And then we were set up again for the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars and the cost of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And whereas we often debate about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, should we have done it? I think it's more useful actually to debate who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy. And I think our frustrations in places like Afghanistan and Iraq is based in large measure on our approach at the time of taking a short-term approach to what was were long-term problem sets in both places, and therefore those wars were lengthened, became more costly. And then, of course, the 2008 financial crisis shook our confidence even further. And it was at that time, I believe, that the emotional impetus behind foreign policy shifted from over-optimism, complacency, maybe even hubris in the 90s to resignation and a deep sense of pessimism, and the associated belief that our disengagement from complex problem sets overseas was an unmitigated good. And what I write about in Battlegrounds is how this swing is associated with what I call strategic narcissism, and that is the tendency for us to define the world only in relation to us. And of course, that's flawed because it's self-referential and because it doesn't recognize the degree to which others, especially adversaries, enemies, and rivals, exert over the future of events and how they too have authorship over the future. So what I argue for in Battlegrounds is a strong dose of strategic empathy, and that's paying particular attention to the ideology and aspirations and emotions that drive and constrain the other. For us to be able then to, based on that better understanding of crucial challenges, to compete more effectively. And the approach I take in the book is to first try to understand how the recent past produced the present as the first step of making a projection into the future. And I apply this approach to what I think are our greatest competitions that we're engaged in today. A China that has become much more aggressive, a Chinese Communist Party, in not only extending and tightening its exclusive grip on power internally, but also much more aggressively exporting its authoritarian mercantilist model. And if China succeeds, our world will be less free, less prosperous, and less safe. A Russia who's also trying to compete in a way to restore national greatness to Russia under Vladimir Putin. He's driven, whereas China is driven, I think, by a sense of fear of losing control and ambition to take center stage in the world and create exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific and to challenge the United States and the free world globally. Russia wants to restore itself to national greatness by dragging everybody else down. Russia knows, that Putin knows he can't compete with us on our own terms. I mean, his entire economy is about the size of Texas's economy. So instead, what he wants to do is to reduce our confidence in who we are as a people. And what he's done in this a sustained campaign of political subversion aimed at Europe and against the United States is to try to polarize us, pit us against each other in a way that reduces confidence in who we are as a people and in our democratic institutions and principles and processes. And he tries to do so mainly on issues of race, but also on policy issues like gun control, for example, or immigration. And of course, he's attacking our democratic process, our election, and doing so in a way that I don't think Putin cares who wins our elections as long as a significant percentage of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result. And then we're facing other threats, jihadist terrorists, transnational threats associated with a set of enemy organizations, jihadist terrorist organizations in South Asia. I criticize in the book this approach to Afghanistan, which prioritizes our withdrawal from Afghanistan over the need to stay engaged to ensure that jihadist terrorists never again enjoy the kind of safe havens, support base, access to resources, and a recruiting base that allowed them to commit the mass murder attacks at 9/11 and others subsequent to the attacks of 9/11 in Europe and the attempted attacks against the United States. And then within the Middle East, which I set this competition against jihadist terrorist organizations in the context of a sectarian civil war that has enmeshed the Middle East in a cycle of conflict, a cycle of conflict that empowers jihadist terrorists and also empowers Iran in its hegemonic designs in the region. And then the book shifts to a more focused look on the threat from hostile states of Iran and North Korea, and then also new arenas of competition that are emerging, and in particular the interconnected problem sets of energy and environment and climate change and food security and water security and health security. So I thought, Jim, maybe I'll just stop there in terms of the introduction of the book. My hope is that the book will allow us to have civil discussions, meaningful discussions about the challenges we face and what we have to do about them to secure a better future for generations to come.
As you noted, I was really engaged and learned a lot from reading this book. Challenged me in a lot of ways. You lay out these 6 different challenges: Russia, China, South Asia, the broader Middle East, Iran, North Korea. And in each case, you have, usually 2 chapters, one that is largely descriptive, and then one that is more prescriptive about how we should counter the challenges that we're facing. And I think in particular, your identification of the trends that our adversaries are using and the way that they're competing against us and identifying vulnerabilities was really exceptional. One theme, though, that I wanted to probe a little bit more deeply on was that a theme running throughout the book, and in particular the prescriptive chapters, is this idea that we have forgotten that we need to compete, and that leaders, elected political leaders in particular, have forgotten that war and national security is a battle of wills. So I'm curious, as you think about this question that leaders face, how much do you think about will, political opinion, resolve as a constraint within which leaders have to operate? And how much is that a variable that they can control?
I think it is absolutely a variable that leaders can control. And one of the disappointments I think we ought to have is that our leaders have not been talking to Americans about the need for a sustained and engaged approach to foreign policy. And they haven't been telling the American people what they deserve to know, which is, first of all, what is at stake in these competitions? So what? What does it mean for Americans? What does it mean for their children and grandchildren? And second, what is a strategy? What is a particular administration's strategy that aims to achieve an outcome favorable to the United States at a cost that is acceptable? And how is the United States going to work alongside like-minded partners to secure a better future? I think it's rare, Jim, that we have these substantive discussions about foreign policy. I think the recent presidential election, the ongoing presidential election, is a case in point. I mean, rarely do we hear meaningful, full, civil, certainly civilities in short supply this discussion about the challenges that we face.
Great. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really striking that comes out in the book. We talk about this polarized environment that adversaries like Russia and China in particular are attacking, but the other adversaries are going after and trying to divide wedges, not just in American politics, but also in our alliances in Europe and in the Pacific. But one thing I want to ask your thoughts on a little bit more is you talk about this commitment that you've had throughout your career to being apolitical, particularly while you were in uniform. And there's no doubt that you display a clear commitment to nonpartisanship throughout this book and throughout your career. But I'm curious whether you think that apolitical and nonpartisan mean the same thing. Given that policy and politics are so central to effective strategy, can military officers and policymakers really draw a neat line between politics and strategy, as you imply that you did, and that many of them should? So I'm curious, are politics are apolitical and nonpartisan different concepts? And if so, how and why might that matter?
Right. So, I mean, by the word, I think it's important to clarify the way that we're using the word political, right? So of course, we as Army officers, right, we are inculcated with the writings of Karl von Clausewitz, right, the 19th century Prussian philosopher of war, who said famously, "War is an extension of politics," and it's kind of like the Geico commercial, right? Well, everybody knows that, right? The war is an extension of politics. But what people forget is that war requires the consolidation of military gains into a sustainable political outcome. So politics, of course, is central, and political competitions, which are competitions for power and resources and influence and sometimes survival, right, are foundational to diplomacy, foundational to military efforts, foundational to intelligence efforts to understand really what is driving and constraining your rivals and adversaries. But when we're talking about politics in this context, we're talking about domestic and partisan political considerations. And it was a bit surreal, Jim, to walk into the West Wing of the White House quite unexpectedly. I mean, I received a phone call. I tell the story in the introduction of the book, as I was walking down Walnut Street, my hometown of Philadelphia, to go to Mar-a-Lago the next day to interview for the job of National Security Advisor. And when the president hired me on Monday, I did not live in Washington, but I went home, packed a bag, and was back in Washington the Tuesday afternoon and went to work. So I didn't have like a lot of time to prepare, but I did have this great gift of the Army giving me the opportunity to study history and to read, research, write, think about national security decision making that led up to the Vietnam War. So when I walked into that office, I mean, it was like I was walking into McGeorge Bundy's office, right? And of course, I had criticized Vietnam War decision making in a number of areas. One of which was President Lyndon Johnson's view of Vietnam principally as a danger to his domestic political priorities, and therefore demanding a course of action for Vietnam that allowed him to escape a difficult decision that might jeopardize getting elected in his own right in 1964 or passing the Great Society legislation in 1965. So when I went into the job, I decided, and I tell this story in the conclusion of Battlegrounds, I put in place a process that was insulated from domestic political considerations, that would view the greatest challenges to our security on their own terms. Then inventory, hey, what vital interests are at stake, right? What's the so what? Why do Americans care about this challenge? View that challenge through the lens of those vital interests, craft an overarching goal and more specific objectives, steps that were skipped in Vietnam, by the way, too, because George Bundy argued, hey, why have an objective, right? Because if we have an objective, we might lose. And if we don't really have a clearly defined objective and we withdraw from Vietnam, we say, oh, that wasn't really our goal anyway, as a free and independent South Vietnam. And then after crafting that overarching goal, more specific objectives, we took the step of identifying assumptions, right? What are the limits? What are the limits on the degree to which we have agency and influence over this complex challenge would be one of the assumptions. And then we would identify obstacles to progress, opportunities, but we framed this challenge first. And then the president's cabinet deliberated on this, talked about it, and then we shared ideas about how we can integrate all elements of our national power, diplomatic efforts, informational efforts, military efforts, intelligence efforts, to law enforcement and so forth, economic efforts, to be able to advance our interests, make progress toward these goals, overcome obstacles, and take advantage of opportunities, right? So we had a sound process, and in that process, we never said, how is this going to affect the midterm elections, or how is this going to affect whatever domestic priority the president had? Now, I wasn't so naive to realize that people who wanted to voice their perspective from on these options we gave the president on domestic politics and how it would affect domestic priorities, they were going to have a voice at some point. I saw it as my job to not allow that kind of thinking to infringe on the development of foreign policy and national security strategy. And I think it worked. I think it worked, Jim, and I think it's possible to do it.
Great. As I mentioned earlier, I was in Vice President Pence's office when you came on board as the National Security Advisor. And, I don't think it's a big secret. This is my own opinion, but the National Security Council processes that were in place when you were coming on board were an absolute mess. And, some of that had to do with the natural tumult of transition, how difficult it can be to realize a new foreign policy vision that we obviously saw as President Trump came on board. Some of that was due to the fact that your predecessor had been removed from his position, and that led to a lot of chaos, not just internally, but also in terms of the press, in terms of the way that our allies, we were getting ready to go to the Munich Security Conference. All eyes were on Vice President Pence, who was going to give an address there, that no longer was the National Security Advisor going to be there, or so we thought at the time. So, one of the things that struck me was you came in and tried to bring rigor to that process in a way that I found personally very helpful as someone trying to work within it. But one thing that is undeniable is that President Trump is not someone who seems to be bound too much by process. And regardless of your views on him, he is someone who is, atypical when it comes to the way that our presidents have made decisions. So I'm curious how you balanced those demands between his unique personality and your desire to impose process in a way that helped advance his goals and our national security objectives.
Well, I think, let me just say that by way of introduction, I think that any national security advisor is in a unique position, obviously, because you're the only person in the foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. And I think that there are really 5 critical tasks that a national security advisor has to accomplish for him or her to serve the elected president well. The first is to staff the president, right? To prepare the president for engagements on issues of foreign policy and national security. That could be a decision-making forum. It could be an engagement with members of Congress, foreign leaders, presidential travel, hosting foreign leaders, phone calls, that sort of thing. The second key task is, as you already alluded to, is to run a process. To run a process which I believe has to be aimed at delivering multiple options to the president, because the president is the person who got elected, right? So it's the president who should be able to choose what his or her agenda is, and it's a disservice to provide one shiny course of action to a president. Say, hey, everybody's behind this, just sign on the dotted line, right? So this was a problem during the Vietnam period as well, right? Is that there was only really one option really brought to Lyndon Johnson. It was based on a contrived consensus to deliver really what he wanted from a domestic political perspective. And then the third, so multiple options, right, is I think and running a process that also then assists with the sensible implementation of the president's decisions and policies. The third key task is a communications task, right, to communicate the president's decisions and policies to the relevant audiences. At times, that's the American public. I would rather heads of departments and agencies do that, but sometimes they were reluctant to do so. But then to communicate to members of Congress, and then to relevant international audiences as well, which relates to the fourth key task, which is to try to keep unity of effort between, with like-minded partners, our allies and partners internationally. So I had really great relationships with other national security advisors, and that was a fun part of the job. And then the fifth is to lead an organization, right? As you mentioned, there are extraordinarily dedicated people, who work in the White House, who are on the National Security Council staff, and you want to do for them what you try to do in a military unit, right? Provide them with purpose, motivation, and direction, right? And then create a climate, right? An environment in which they want to come to work. They're bound together by a common purpose and mutual respect. You build an organization that's valued and trusted across the government, but also internationally. So those are the 5 tasks, right? And I think that it's a disservice to tell the president what the president wants to hear. And as you know, probably around any president, there is an environment of what you might call competitive sycophancy, right? Where and you see this in the military at times too. But I was never one to kind of sign up for that program, because I think it is a disservice, right, to tell people what they want to hear. I think the process served President Trump well during the 13 months I was there. I will tell you, Jim, as you probably saw, by running that process, I got used up, right? And I was at peace with that. That was going to happen. And that's, I think, in large measure because there are those who don't want that kind of a process to proceed, either because they're not there to give the elected president options, they're there instead to advance their own agenda, and they want to manipulate decisions consistent with their own agenda, or they are in the role of kind of the anonymous writer, right? Which is they think they're there to save the country and maybe the world from the president. Now, the danger of those two other groups is they undermine the Constitution of the United States. They undermine the sovereignty of the American people because nobody elected them to make policy, right? I mean, if you want a check on the president's power, that check is in the form of law, in the form of our Constitution, which of course is Article 1, our Congress, and the judiciary, and the ultimate check is at the ballot box, right? So I just think that that it's unfortunate that more people aren't in the category of, hey, I'm here to serve the elected president, to give that president options, right? And I think that's the best way to serve any president. Now, I'll tell you, I mean, a lot of times with President Trump, he probably didn't want to hear full range of options, or advantages and disadvantages. But hey, I think it would have been a tremendous disservice to him, and I think he would agree at this point anyway, that we got a lot of good policy outcomes. One of the things we were able to do, Jim, by taking this approach, is we scrutinized the assumptions on which previous policies were based, right? And then we were able to take what oftentimes are implicit and flawed assumptions that underpin policies and expose them to scrutiny, and then make major adjustments to our foreign policy. This is essentially the approach we took on China and what to do about the Chinese Communist Party's aggression.
Great. Now, I know that we've got a lot of questions coming in, so I will use my prerogative to ask you one more, and then we'll get to this great list that I've seen.
And as you know, Jim, succinctness has never been my strong point, but I'm working on it. I'll try to be sure. I'll try to be.
No problem at all. Now, I want to come back to dereliction of duty, and I want to ask you two parts to this question. So the first is, after having this experience of serving in the inner circle of a president like you did, with lots of contentious foreign policy issues at stake, first, I want to know, if you went back and wrote the book today, would it change your analysis of that period in any way? And then the second is, when that young captain or major who's out there on their third deployment in Afghanistan comes back to the University of Texas or to Stanford or wherever it is that they come back to examine this period in the Trump administration, what will they have to say about the way you handled your roles and responsibilities as a national security advisor?
First of all, I'll tell you, I wouldn't change anything. I mean, I really, honestly, I think if anything, it amplified my understanding of key elements of national security decision-making and policy-making, the formation of strategy at the highest levels. And what I brought into the job, I think helped me, I think, deliver a good service to the president and to our government broadly in that period of time. So what were some of those lessons from dereliction of duty that I brought in with me? I mean, the first of these, that, hey, we ought to try to understand challenges before we just act. Right? And I think in Vietnam, we confused activity with progress and didn't think hard enough about how those actions and initiatives and programs and operations and the commitment of troops and the bombing of the North were either contributing to or detracting from accomplishing our goals and objectives, because we didn't apply kind of design thinking and try to frame problems. So we put a system in place to do that, and I think I saw the value of doing that. The second I already mentioned, right, is multiple options, right? No single shiny consensus position, because it is in the comparison of options that you can expose advantages and disadvantages and differences in cost and risk and effectiveness of various courses of action in connection with those what you hope are already agreed goals and objectives. The third is again, this we already mentioned, the not to allow domestic political considerations to corrupt the development of foreign policy, and to try to put into place foundation for a sustained, really nonpartisan foreign policy, so we can have a long-term approach to it, advancing and protecting our interests. And I could go on with other lessons that were magnified: the importance of personalities and relationships, the importance of having a bias toward collaboration, and for bringing in interdisciplinary perspectives into this effort. So I think that all of those lessons were magnified. If a captain comes back from Afghanistan, a major comes back to Afghanistan, and studying at the University of Texas and the wonderful programs you have there in history and national security, international relations, I hope what that major would say is that I did my best to put into place a strategy that was not only effective, but that was ethical and moral. Okay, and the reason I'm saying that is I think that our lack of strategic competence these days has actually led to situations where the evolution of the wars that we're in and the evolution of those strategies produce a situation in which we are waging wars that no longer meet St. Thomas Aquinas's test of jus ad bellum, just war, and in particular, not having a just end in mind and having that just end well defined, and then developing a strategy that can meet, I think, Jim, what is the ultimate test of strategy is whether a young platoon leader can look at his or her soldiers in the eye and explain to them how the risks that they will take on that mission and the sacrifices that they may make or see their brothers and sisters make are contributing to an outcome worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. And I believe certainly now in Afghanistan that is not the case. I think that the test of strategy fails there, but I do believe that we put in place the first time a sound and sustainable strategy for Afghanistan, and that was the one that the president announced in a speech in August of 2017. Regrettably, he and the administration backed off from that and have in effect partnered with the Taliban against the Afghan government. I mean, we gave all these concessions to an organization that is a terrorist organization that is given to the worst forms of brutality, and it desires to reestablish the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, an organization that is utterly intertwined, with other terrorist organizations who want to continue to commit mass murder against innocents as their principal tactic against all civilized peoples. And I think that this is a travesty, and I again, it is a extreme case of strategic narcissism. Where in Afghanistan we actually conjured the enemy we preferred, rather than the actual enemy that we're fighting there. And what is I think paradoxical about this is that the Trump administration came in and President Trump did, saying, hey, he wanted to reverse the flaws in the Obama administration's approach to Afghanistan in particular. I believe that President Trump and the administration did that in August of 2017. But I think after that, they began to prioritize withdrawal over achieving an outcome in Afghanistan consistent with our interests and the interests of all humanity. Then what they essentially did is exceeded the flaws in the Obama administration's approach to Afghanistan and the region, because this includes Pakistan and Pakistan's role in perpetuating the threat from the Taliban. So I could go on about that, but I hope I hope that the major would say, hey, he did his best to ensure that there was a sound logic that underpinned our approach, especially to the wars that are still ongoing, right, in South Asia, across the Middle East, and in parts of Africa.
Great, thanks. So now we'll start to turn through some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience. The first one is from Terry Tottenham, and it's a question that has loomed large over this administration since even before the election of President Trump, and that is the president's unique relationship with Russia and President Putin in particular. And the question that Terry has asked is whether or not you believe that President Putin has any unique sway or influence over President Trump, and if so, where does that leverage or influence come from? How does he exercise it, and why?
Yeah, I think what's clear, what I can tell you that is clear to me is that President Trump labors under the illusion that he can have a better relationship with Putin, and then that would be good for the United States and our interests. Okay, well, all right, that'd be great. Wouldn't that be great if Russia had a closer relationship to the United States than it did with China, for example? And we could go back to what Henry Kissinger pioneered with President Nixon of triangular diplomacy, whereas China and Russia both had a closer relationship with us than they did with each other. Sure, that'd be great. But it's not going to happen. And the story I tell in Battlegrounds is how three successive administrations bought into this self-delusion, essentially. You remember when George W. Bush looked into Putin's soul, right? And Putin told him the story about the cross around his neck that was totally apocryphal and so forth. Putin's the best liar in the world. Remember when President Obama prioritized the reset and sent Secretary Clinton, to Geneva with the reset button for Lavrov, and President Obama leaned over to Medvedev when he was keeping the seat warm for Putin, and said, "Hey, we'll have more flexibility after the election." Traded off missile defense in Poland in the hopes of a better relationship, and of course, your President Trump say this all the time. Wouldn't it be great if we had a better relationship? Well, we're not going to have a better relationship because, again, as I mentioned just in the beginning, Putin is determined to drag us down under the theory that he can't compete with us on our own terms, but he can just be the last man standing, right after the West, Europe and the United States destroy ourselves, right, by our internal polarization and our lack of confidence in who we are and in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. I don't know why the president doesn't recognize this threat and expose it more publicly, but the administration has taken actions to defend against Putin's campaign of subversion. But every time President Trump says, "Hey, I don't know, if it was Russia?" I mean, it gives Putin an opportunity. I describe Russia's strategy as one of disruption, disinformation, and denial. And that denial is actually implausible deniability by Putin, because he'll commit the most egregious acts against us, he and his agents, and then just simply deny it. And the president or any leader shouldn't give them cover to do that.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Peter Sluskine, one of our great graduate fellows here at the Clements Center, and he is doing research into this concept of the free world. And he writes, in the middle of the 20th century, American policymakers committed the country to a grand strategy of global leadership in the name of defending a territorial-defined free world against the communist world. Now, these appeals to the free world greatly diminished at the end of the 60s and into the later parts of the 20th century, and essentially disappeared after the collapse of the communist bloc. But the concept now appears to be experiencing a resurgence, and it's part of the subtitle of your book. Could you explain why you chose to foreground this concept of the free world in particular in the title of the book, rather than say, the United States or democracy? And how would you define this concept of the free world? And who does this concept really belong to?
Well, I believe that we are in a competition now between our free and open societies and closed authoritarian systems. That competition is not monolithic competition, but it is mainly a competition between the authoritarian mercantilist system, the statist economic system that China is promoting. China is promoting through this campaign of coaction, coercion, and concealment. And I think that we have to see it as a competition so that we can strengthen what should be our competitive advantages. This theme in the book, it goes through the book, but in chapter 4, it's entitled "Turning Weakness into Strength." And in that chapter, I argue that we ought to turn what China perceives as weaknesses into our greatest strengths. So what does China perceive as a weakness? What China perceives as a weakness is any of their citizens having the temerity to suggest that they might have a say in how they're governed, right? The Chinese people, that's what the party fears the most, is the Chinese people will, as they did in 1989 in Tiananmen, or as they have been in Hong Kong, say that we ought to have a say in how we're governed. So in the West, we ought to strengthen our democratic principles and institutions and processes and restore our confidence in them. That's why when our leaders talk about our elections or try to sow doubts about the sanctity of our electoral processes for partisan political gain, I mean, they're working against our free and open society, and they're working against democracy broadly, and they ought to just stop it, right? I argue in the book that we ought to demand that our leaders not compromise principles for partisan political advantage. What else does the Chinese Communist Party fear? They fear rule of law, right? Because if they had rule of law, they wouldn't be building, annexes and extensions onto the concentration camps into which they've put over 1 million Uyghurs. They wouldn't be rounding up anybody who criticizes the party. Just in recent weeks, sentencing one critic of Xi Jinping to 18 years in prison. They wouldn't be rounding up so-called Taiwanese spies or those they're accusing of subversion in Hong Kong. They wouldn't be racing to put into place a technologically enabled Orwellian surveillance police state inside of China and weaponizing people's social networks against them with a social credit score. So we should strengthen rule of law here in the United States, but also in countries who want to establish democratic governance and rule of law, because this is not just some kind of altruistic mission. This isn't some kind of Kantian notion of us bringing humanity up. This is hard-nosed John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. This is the best way to counter China's authoritarian system and the exportation of that system. What else do they fear? They fear freedom of the press and freedom of speech. We ought to strengthen our fourth estate. We have to reestablish, I think, standards of journalism, and we as Americans ought to have confidence in authoritative sources of information rather than some of us based on political leanings watching one cable news station, some of us based on political leanings watching one of two others, instead of being susceptible, right, to the way social media algorithms pull us apart from each other, or the sowing of these ridiculous conspiracy theories in the pseudo media. So I think that let's strengthen what they perceive as weakness, right? And I think that, so I think it's useful, Peter, to think about this as a competition between between the free world and these authoritarian systems that are a threat to freedom and democracy. And it's not that we're going to impose Jeffersonian democracy on others, that we're going to engage in what is now the dirty term of nation building, But when people want to help themselves, right? When people want to have a say in how they're governed, when they want rule of law, when they want to exercise freedom of speech and freedom of the press, we ought to be supportive of that, and to do so in a way that recognizes that this is the best way for us to compete and the best way to build a future for generations to come.
Great, sir. So, as you mentioned, the last part of this discussion was focused on China in particular. And I think, as you, Will, and I talked about before this kicked off, we do think there is at least a growing bipartisan recognition of the challenges China poses for us. Ronald Luke asks, in addition to the ways that we can build this resilience internally and in other nations that may be susceptible to China's aggressive influence campaigns, what are your other recommendations for U.S. policy towards China, and how can we compete with them more directly in whatever administration comes to power?
Okay, so I think there are two fundamental ways that we have to compete. One is to defend, right? To defend against what is a pernicious strategy, a strategy that employs really three integrated strategies against us: military-civil fusion, made in China 2025, and one belt, one road. So there are defensive measures we have to take against China's sustained campaign of industrial espionage. I lay these out in more detail in the book, and against really this effort to create servile relationships with countries through through setting debt traps for mainly corrupt regimes, such that China then gains coercive power over those governments and really over strategic geographic locations, as well as global logistics and communications infrastructure. So we have to compete more effectively by defending against this really sustained and very well integrated family of strategies that together allow China to advance its interests at our expense. But then we have to be, I think, introspective as well in our own competitive advantages, as I mentioned, such that we can compete more effectively in the emerging data-driven global economy, and also maintain our competitive advantages militarily. In doing so, we need to evidence the highest degree of international cooperation. If we don't, we won't be effective, because China will play us off against each other, us being especially the world's largest economies. So I think the main forum for cooperation is between the United States, Japan, and the European Union, and now the UK as well. But we need to bring in other countries, India, for example, and those arenas of competition that we have to re-enter are economic. They're also security and intelligence and so forth. But they also have a lot to do with standard setting for privacy and data standards that are going to be very important to the emerging global economy. China recognizes this and has a new China Standards 2035 program. Of course they do, right? Which is to try to bend these standards such that they favor China, for example. It means competing much more effectively within international organizations. It should be clear to us by now, this whole idea of global governance. I mean, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, but it's just not going to happen. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, Russia, other nefarious actors, they're not waiting to be led. They're not joining a condominium of nations that are going to work together on our biggest problems. So we have to recognize that there's no prize for membership in international organizations. We have to compete within those organizations in the recognition that China and others try to turn those organizations against their very purpose. This is what's happened in the Human Rights Council, for example. It's what's happened in UNESCO. It's what happened in the World Health Organization, an organization that was subverted by Chinese Communist Party influence. So only by bonding ourselves together with like-minded countries can we compete more effectively within international fora as well. So I cover all this in more detail in the book, but that's the general idea, right? Defend more effectively, right? And recognize that we've been under assault in many arenas of competition that we largely vacated. The second, though, is to strengthen our competitive advantages. And the third aspect of this really is to foster an extremely high degree of international cooperation. There is a growing degree of international cooperation ongoing. So I think the trend is in the right direction, but we have to step it up. Whoever's sworn in on January 20th, I think ought to take that fundamental approach.
Great. So, one thing I think that is clear is that both China and Russia have identified and tried to drive wedges between American citizens in our own domestic politics through race, through partisanship, through whatever. But it's also true that they didn't create all of those fissures. They're simply trying to take advantage of them. And we have a couple questions that are coming in on this topic of how do we address the average citizen in a way that can be persuasive and compelling. And we've obviously talked earlier about the role that you see elected political leaders in particular playing in explaining the costs to the American people. But I'd also like to ask with this question from Jordan Slopey, and I apologize, James Mashish, pretty sure I got that wrong, but they ask, how do we engage the American people in a way that allows them to understand those costs? And how do we insulate from the potential, civilian felt costs? How do we protect them from exploitation when it's not just a matter of messaging, it's also a matter of, regulation and social media and competitive media environments that are often focused on demonizing our domestic political opponents, sometimes to the extent that, you'll have, domestic partisans think that our adversaries are actually more popular, or they'll have a more favorable rating of domestic political leaders than opponents in the other political parties. So could you speak more? What does it take to actually get the United States back on a track to solve that problem?
Well, thanks for those questions. I mean, I think in one word, it's education, right? In one word is education. And that's what I'm hoping to do with Battlegrounds is that, that book was a continuation of my own self-education. And in the conclusion, I quote my friend Zachary Shore, from whom I also borrowed the term strategic empathy, that the greatest source of strength for any nation is an educated populace. Education about the challenges that we face, so we can understand better the nature of these threats, so we can expose whether it's Russia's campaign of disruption, disinformation, and denial, or China's campaign of coaction, coercion, and concealment. If you notice, I use alliteration as a method to try to remember and to help impart some kind of a framework understanding of these threats. But really, it's education about who we are. It's a sense of our own history, Jim. I really am concerned about civics education. I write about this in the conclusion, and the need for us to have a better understanding of our shared history as Americans, as a way to strengthen, even when we can we can celebrate a more defined identities, cultural identities, and other aspects of who we are. I think we also need to place that in the context of a broader American identity. Francis Fukuyama writes about this in his book Identity. And I think we can do that through a better understanding of our history, not a contrived, happy view of history, a very critical view of our history, but one that allows us to celebrate the radical idea of our revolution, that sovereignty lies neither with king nor parliament, but with the people. and to celebrate the unalienable rights that are enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, in our Constitution and Bill of Rights, but then also in full recognition that it wasn't until almost 100 years after the formation of our country that we resolved the greatest blight on our history, which was the institution of slavery. But then to celebrate the fact that the most destructive war in our history was waged to emancipate 4 million of our fellow Americans. And then we can then also be disappointed, though, with the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, the period of separate but equal, but then also celebrate the achievements of the civil rights movement and the dismantlement of at least de jure segregation and inequality of opportunity. Still, again, in full recognition that there's de facto inequality of opportunity, de facto segregation that we have to work on together as Americans. But I think an understanding of our history should instill confidence in us, confidence that we can continue to nurture our democracy, which is what our founders said from the very beginning, right? That we will have to constantly nurture our democracy, and we ought to celebrate. We ought to celebrate the fact that we do have a say in how we're governed, right? We're not living in China. We ought to also be proud of the fact that people want to immigrate to the United States, and we ought to stop this, talking constantly about who we don't want in our country. I have a paragraph in the conclusion, which I argue that we should talk more about who we need, because immigrants have been the strength of our nation. Hey, nobody's trying to immigrate to China, to communist China right now, Jim. And we ought to be proud about that. So I think a better understanding of our history and who we are as Americans will help us transcend what I believe today is an interaction between maybe identity politics, or however you want to label it, with bigotry and racism. And that is creating these centripetal forces, this interaction that is pulling us apart from each other. The vast majority of us, I think, could reject both of those extremes and reestablish our identity as Americans. We see this in the Army, Jim, right? I mean, you see people come into the Army from all different backgrounds, right? They carry all different baggage with them in terms of biases or prejudices. But once they come together in a unit that takes on over time with shared hardships and reliance on one another, you take on the qualities of a family. And especially in combat, obviously, when bullets are coming in your direction, you're not checking anybody's skin color or religion or political party or sexual orientation, right? And you become a family. And we need to become a family again in America. And I write in the book about how we all have responsibility to do this. And what we have to be able to do is empathize and understand one another, instead of saying, well, you can't even understand. You have no right to empathize with me. I mean, it's really become, I think, a dangerous dynamic these days. And I think that in many ways, our young people are subjected to a curriculum in history in particular that generates this kind of, I would call it almost a mild form of self-loathing, right? And a pessimistic view, certainly, of our history and who we are. And again, the corrective to that is not some kind of contrived happy view, right? That goes back to interpretations that, the Civil War was about states' rights instead of slavery, or whatever. I mean, we need a clear-eyed view of our history, but that clear-eyed view ought to not favor, this sort of pessimistic and almost I think polarizing view in and of itself of who we are as a people.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.